My name is Jason Harrell. My title is Corporate Information Security Officer for Investment Management. Um, and my responsibilities are I am accountable for designing and developing our information risk program, working with our senior executives in order to help them understand our risk related to our cybersecurity posture, and doing a translation between the legal, operational, client, uh, and regulatory impacts that cybersecurity has on our space, and make sure that those are well understood within our executive and board level. The important difference between what my role is and what you have in an information security officer role is uh, a security officer or a CISO role is looking at risk from a technology basis. Like, what are our technology risks that we have to our business? As a corporate information risk officer, senior information risk officer, what my role is to take technology as an input, legal risks as an input, regulatory risk as an input. All these things are inputs to what we need to do to make a business decision on our risk. So if we are missing one of those aspects, then, or we don't understand one of those aspects, then it becomes hard for us to be able to quantify and adequately prioritize our risk management efforts. So it's important for us to have the CISO to tell us our technology-based risks, but we also need to have the other parts of the organization. And you need to have someone in order to translate what those risks mean to your risk posture in order to have a clear picture. So, in absence, number one is the absence, if you have absence of one of those. And the second part is somebody who understands and can relate to risk in the way that those different parts of the organization um, uh, relate to cybersecurity. So, how does legal relate to cybersecurity? How does your regulatory compliance group, relate to cybersecurity? How do your technologists relate to cybersecurity? And then taking that viewpoint and then being able to come up with something comprehensive so that your CEO or your board can understand. The numerous occurrences of these cybersecurity events has prompted the National Association of Corporate Directors to provide guidance to the boards on what they should know, which then, of course, puts pressure on the executive management because they have to answer the board's questions related to cybersecurity, and then that gets pushed on down the line. The underlying people for the executive directors need to be able to provide them with information on cybersecurity risk and management. So then it gets pushed down through the organization. So of course that then you have that internal driver. The second is client, and as a consumer, people are more and more aware of the value of the information that they provide, and they want to know how you're going to protect it. So if you have a large consumer base business where you hold their personal information, they want to know, what you're doing to protect it, and if there's a breach of that information, they want to seriously consider their other options. So you can quickly lose market share because your clients have decided that you do not do an adequate job of protecting their information, so they'll go to someone who will. From an institutional client side, you you have a lot of the onus is being put on those clients from their regulators to understand how you do information protection. So now your institutional clients want to know, how do you actually protect their information and their underlying client information, and have some idea of the protections that you have in place, insurance and the like, to protect their information or to at least cover them for losses when there is a breach of information. And then the other two are government and regulatory. So within financial services, with with the government's push to understand the state of readiness for the financial industry, because we do, the national economic health is considered to be part of what is needed for our way of life, which I completely agree with. So they need to have some level of comfort, and your government or our government is, from the Congress and the Senate are going to be holding our regulators' feet to the fire and understanding our state of readiness. And so, in order to understand our state of readiness, they have to examine and look and poke and prod and test those controls. And then regulation is continuing to be put out, whether it's regulatory guidance like third-party vendor management and what needs to be done there, and it's not just domestic in the U.S. If you have a global organization, it's the monetary authorities in Asia Pacific, it's the central banks in South America, it's the central banks in the EMEA regions, all of them coming up with different types of guidances for managing cybersecurity risk. And some of those are very prescriptive, so you need to understand as an organization which regulators are putting out prescriptive guidance so that you can ensure that you're meeting all your regulatory requirements as well as protecting your client information. So I think those four things, internal drivers, your client drivers, your government drivers, your regulatory drivers, are what's really driving the cybersecurity agenda. As an organization, you can, make sure that you're compliant with the law by making sure you're compliant with the rule. So, since there is no specific rule governing and being prescriptive about cybersecurity, what is happening is they're using the current constructs of what has always been required from an organization's fiduciary responsibility to its clients and customers. What they're doing is saying, no matter what vertical of financial industry that you work in, one of the fundamental things that they require is that you have written policies and procedures that are adequate to protect your business from the risk related to its business operations. And some of them will say under federal securities laws or whatever law that they have for the land, but really it's around written policies and standards adequate to manage your risks to your business. So cybersecurity is a risk, or the lack of cybersecurity is a risk to your business. So if you are not doing these things to protect your businesses from cyber attacks and the other cyber risks, then you are not adequately managing your risk, and therefore you are in violation of whatever rule that the regulator has put out there. So whether it's compliance rule 38A1-C of the Investment Advisors Act, or some other, CFTC or whatever regulatory authority has put out a rule related to written policies and standards, that's what they're using in order to enforce cybersecurity controls. The NIST framework was brought about by the executive order 13636 that the Obama administration had put out. And it was not only set so that financial institutions could, come up with a framework for managing their risk. They provided a framework that any organization can use to adequately manage its risk. The nice thing about the NIST framework is that it's modular and it allows the organization to define out what those controls should be. So they give you a method of thinking about the risks, and they give you pointers to other guidance that has already been developed so that you can adequately populate an initial risk posture. But right now it's voluntary. It is a way to manage your risk. It is probably a preferred way if you are not, if you are in an organization that doesn't have a lot of risk managers, but you still need to manage this risk. It'll give you a way to think about how you're going to manage the risk. Will some organizations be forced to use it as mandatory? It's still in the works. We're trying to look at ways that can incentivize organizations to use the framework. So it's from that type of a move, it's obvious to me that they want people to use the framework. They've gone through great lengths to develop the framework. They had the NIST organization working together with the private sector to develop the framework, so it's had a lot of industry input. So since all this work has been done to develop this framework, then it probably is a prudent thing for us to be using the framework. Again, but it's not the end all be all because it is not prescriptive. It does allow for, if I'm a credit card company, I'm going to have more stringent controls on my data than maybe an organization that sells food or produce. Why? Because the impact that the loss of information that I have is going to be, number one, the level of expectation for the controls of that information are going to be much higher for my credit card information and people's personal information than maybe an inventory for how many heads of lettuce that I have. So it has to be something that is fit for your risk profile. So it can't be prescriptive. So it has to be open. I see the role of the CISO changing actually very significantly. And the reason I say that is because when a business thinks about cybersecurity risk management, they still think of it as a technology issue, even though we'll say that it's an enterprise risk issue. And I'm not going by what people say. I go by how they respond during an incident or when a question is asked. If you can say that something is an enterprise risk issue, but then when something happens, if you say, well, I went to my technology person and asked them whatever, then that tells me that you think it's a technology issue. So since a lot of the CISOs sit in technology, they're ultimately going to get that question. So you have two options. You have one option is to try to change the entire mindset of people going to technology and going to someone else, and then defining who that someone else will be, or what other group that will be. Or you go, okay, as the CISO, you will now need to not only know your technology risk, but I need you to understand the legal frameworks that are being used to enforce cybersecurity controls. I want you to also know the regulatory aspects of these cybersecurity controls. And not only that, I want you to then be in control of the process of bringing all the groups and operational teams together to come up with a comprehensive way of managing that risk. So you only have two options, and right now everybody's looking at the CISO. So I see the CISO's role expanding simply because the risks are so pervasive that you need to have someone designated, and if that designated person is the CISO, then their skill set is going to have to increase tremendously in order to be able to manage it. How are you going to learn about all of these different regulatory aspects that could impact cybersecurity? How else are you going to learn legal? There's not JDs out there trying to learn a lot about cybersecurity. So how are you going to do that? It's really, I think, it's going to have to become a curriculum.